Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dan Hendy. I'm the Senior Education Manager here at the Pennsylvania Recreation and Park Society, and I'm welcoming you to today's webinar, Pickleball, the Sound and Fury. We have three guest presenters with us today. First one up is Andy Carboleria. He's with Ascentech Incorporated. Matter of fact, he's a principal at Ascentech, a world-class acoustics, technology, and vibration consulting firm. He has over 20 years of consulting experience managing all aspects of architectural acoustics, including room, sound isolation, noise and vibration control, and electroacoustic systems. He shares his acoustical expertise as a speaker at national conferences and symposium, and is an author for the industry. Also joining us today is Susan Wheeler. She's project manager for Township, Pennsylvania. And for more than 20 years, Susan's focus has been on the planning, development, construction, management of parks and recreation projects. In addition to Patton Township, she has served as project manager for land developers and environmental regulatory agencies. She holds a BS in environmental science and a GIS certification. And rounding out our list of presenters today is Dr. Barry Weierman. He's with Pickleball Sound Mitigation, Barry is the principal acoustical engineer for PSM, and he's a registered professional engineer and has worked in the acoustical industry for over 40 years. His experience includes architectural acoustics, industrial noise abatement, automotive noise and vibration control, and product development. He's also a pickleball player and referee. They had significant help coordinating this webinar with the Institute of Noise Control Engineering, and we welcome all of you engineers today. So let's get started. Get us started right away, and I want to ask our panelists, while many in this webinar may already be aware, can someone explain why the noise from pickleball can be disturbing? What is about its quality or quantity and pattern that makes it so disturbing? Barry, you want to take that?
I can jump in on that. Pickleball is somewhat unique in that it is an impulsive sound that is intermittent. The main frequency of pickleball sound is around 1,000 hertz. So that aligns with the maximum sensitivity of human hearing. And the fact that it is an intermittent sound tends to make it a little bit more annoying than a continuous sound of the same nature. And certainly, if you have more courts in play, you are going to hear more impulses in any period of observation. Yeah. And I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, and I'm going to back up a little bit because maybe we should have something to sort of base us off. Susan had the opportunity to develop a pickleball court in her area in Patton Township. And did you say 2016, did you say, Susan?
Well, we started the process. The construction actually occurred in 2019.
Okay, it started in 2016.
We started the conversations about pickleball development in 2016. So it was a 3-year process before we were fully invested in making a conversion. Just as to give you a bit of background, this is a park in Patton Township called Green Hollow Park, which is 6 acres, but sits in a hollow. About 4 acres of the 6 acres are developed into traditional playground equipment and tennis courts and basketball, but the rest of the 6 acres or remaining 4 acres are wooded. And we had aging tennis courts in disrepair in the park in 2015. So we did a community survey of all the residents in Park Forest Village. We had about a 15% response rate to the survey. Many people asking whether or not we could convert to pickleball because it was something that was on their forefront of their minds as opposed to having tennis. Our Recreation Advisory Committee started to consider this, and we actually had 2 tennis courts that were in disrepair in Green Hollow. We had a bank of 4 brand new tennis courts at a place called Burnell Road Park, which is more distant to the residential neighborhoods. And they decided they'd like to add pickleball so we could actually add to the inventory of recreational opportunities in the township. So they started talking about it in 2017 and spent a year actually talking to people in the community, looking at national trends and collecting information on conversion. And at that same time, our local Central Region Parks and Recreation group had actually dual striped many of the tennis courts in the area to pickleball in response to the fact that lots of people wanted to play. So when 2019, we went ahead and awarded a contractor the contract to convert 2 tennis courts to 4 pickleball courts, and construction took place in 2019. There was a small amount of play at the end of 2019, and then as we moved into 2020, there was spring play. And then, as we all recall, or perhaps we don't recall, in the spring of 2020, we had all the COVID shutdowns. And so people were in their homes for a while. And then when things started to open up, it really was mostly outdoor recreation that people were trying to get a hold of. So we found a huge upswing in all of the park use in our municipality, including pickleball. And what happened is everyone who wanted to play pickleball knew that we had new courts in Green Hollow, and they were free play. You didn't have to sign up with the YMCA or any of the other centers, the sports centers, and everyone converged on Green Hollow Park. So that, in fact, was encouraging from the perspective of someone who builds recreational facilities, but it was discouraging from the perspective of some of the neighbors who lived in that area, who found, as Barry has just mentioned, that sound intermittent at the high pitch to be completely disturbing. So in 2020, in the summer and fall, we had some noise complaints that came to our Recreation Advisory Committee. And it was a handful of residents out of all the neighbors who live around that park. It was a couple neighbors who were quite close to the park, so I would say within 190 feet from the park, but at an elevation change of about 30 feet from the surface of the courts to the back of the homes. Additionally, a few people who lived up the road who would be probably at a 40-foot elevation change, but maybe almost as far as 300 or 500 feet away, would also make some complaints. So when they came to the Recreation Advisory Committee, the RAC said, all right, well, we understand what you're saying, so we'll post hours of play. So we posted hours of play to only have it during certain hours when it would be least disruptive to the neighbors. As it turned out, most people disregarded that who were playing, and they played at all hours. So the result of that is that when a complaint comes in of anything like that, it comes to our police department and it becomes a police call. So the police were out at the park often in response to these issues. Additionally, Green Hollow Park is located in a neighborhood where there's no dedicated parkings for the park, so people park on the streets. So the secondary complaint to all of this was that there was parking in areas where no one had seen parking before. The additional to talk about the sound was not just the sound of the pickleball ball hitting the paddle, but also the enthusiasm of the players. So when people play pickleball, they generally play in groups and they rotate, and there's a lot of activity and a lot of whooping and hollering and shouting and glee. And that was an additional sound problem for some of the neighbors in that neighborhood. So when that came to the RAC, it then went to our Board of Supervisors, and the Board of Supervisors formed a pickleball advisory committee that was made up of neighbors, anti or pro pickleball, the broader community, people from Parks and Rec. It did not include any engineers, I must point out, and perhaps that was a flaw of ours. But we went through many discussions, and because the opinions were so polarized, there could not be a meeting of the minds. At the township level, we did decide to do a noise study, which we had done, but it didn't help us in any way, really, particularly because it still didn't help the people who were really offended by the sound or really disturbed by the sound. So after probably a year and a half of public meetings and a lot of controversy, and then only having a further reduction of hours at the Green Hollow courts, our board decided late in 2021 that they would convert those 4 pickleball courts back into 2 tennis courts. And the other part of that solution was that we had a bank of 4 tennis courts in another park, which was a distance from residences. And we took 2 of those tennis courts and converted them to 6 pickleball courts. So we did that actually in 2022. And we converted the tennis courts back, pardon me, the pickleball courts back to tennis courts at a cost of $35,000. And then when we took the 2 courts out of the bank of 4 at Burnell Road Park, that was a cost of $66,000 to convert from 2 tennis courts to 6. So all by way of saying that there are some financial ramifications also if you don't get it right. And whether or not you get it right is based on not just physical location, but also the subjective response of the people around that facility. So this has been in place since 2022. This is now 2024. I can give you a little bit of a 2023 and beyond, that now that we have 6 courts at Burnell, they are enthusiastically played all the time. So now we're moving into the realm of new signage, additional signage, how to manage that excessive play, because our courts at Burnell are the only free public play in the town. Everyone else would pay at the YMCA or sports center or something like that. And additionally to that, we still get some complaints from the Park Forest neighborhood because some of the people who live in that neighborhood sneak into the tennis courts as families or as 2 teenagers to play pickleball. And then we again get noise complaints. So that's in a nutshell what we've gone through. And as I say, we started the actual process late in 2016 as a solution to an existing failing or aging facility. And now we're in 2024 and the conversation continues.
Thank you, Susan. So we do have a comment that would be best to include nearby neighbors, tennis players, when doing an advisory committee. How did you do that at Patton Township? And
What was the question again, please?
it says it would be when forming an advisory committee, it would be best if they include nearby neighbors, tennis players, children, playground visitors, and other park stakeholders. Did you
Yes.
have an advisory committee of sorts?
Yes, we did have an advisory committee, which included neighbors. They included tennis players, pickleball players, people who lived in the neighborhood, people who played those sports who lived outside the neighborhood, but it did include the neighborhood, and all of our meetings were public. It was during COVID, but they were all obviously on Zoom. But we would have, of the committee, which was 12 people, I think that the people who attended via Zoom were in the 40s, 50s, 60s at any given time that we had a meeting, and they almost were all people from that neighborhood.
And I wonder if COVID, it could have affected the meeting, and it could have, do you think it also affected the intensity of the use of that court area during that time?
Well, I call it the perfect storm. I think that in fact, if this facility had opened and it was not at the beginning of COVID, or coming out of COVID or during that time, the amount of play would have been different. Although having said that, I don't know that that would have changed the perception of sound by the people who didn't like the sound. I think you would have had less play because people would have distributed differently. And as I mentioned, Parks and Rec department here has striped a lot of our tennis courts into dual play for pickleball. So you can play pickleball on a tennis court, which people do quite happily, depending on your interest and skill set. But I think that it may have progressed differently if it had not been during the time that people were coming out of COVID looking for a place to play all kinds of different sports.
Yeah. And then you also have all the people that if they're not outside, they're definitely inside their house also.
Yes.
So
Yes,
they're
absolutely.
home all the time.
And in fact, that was part of what prompted the people who were the first people who complained about the sound, was that they were working from home and they lived right next to it. And although their windows were closed, they had a sensitivity and could hear it. And so it was really multifaceted issue.
Okay, and Miss Susan's referring to Park Forest neighborhood of State College, which is an older, I would call it an older residential or planned area.
Yes.
With medium to medium high income level. Would that be accurate?
Yes, and I think around a number of residents back up to Green Hollow Park, and Green Hollow Park is called Green Hollow because it does sit in a hollow. And when that neighborhood was first developed, as maybe you know, if you work in land development, generally when a developer gives parkland, it's the least valuable piece of land that he has in that area. And so the hollow became the park, which is a wonderful place in the summer because it's probably 10 degrees cooler than anywhere else. But at the same time, it has acoustic issues. I think that years ago, they used to play Little League in there. And at that time, and this, when I say years ago, this would probably be 25 years ago, they would have Little League. And at that time, everybody would do the same thing. Everyone parked on the streets. There was a congestion. There was all kinds of noise that came out of the park, kind of in the same way. But people were not as, were not as bothered by the sound of Little League or T-ball as they were compared to the sound of a pickleball ball and a pickleball paddle.
Okay, thank you, Susan. So
Thank
let's get to the sound in the fury, so to say. Andy, do you want to? I know Dr. Weierman said the 1,000 hertz and the intermittent sound was, one of the keys to why pickleball could be considered disturbing. Do you want to add to that?
I do, yeah. And then I also have a question for Susan, because I think kind of the context and the experience that she shared is hugely useful to the discussion. I would totally agree with everything that Barry said. Maybe one of the things that I would just kind of add to that is that what we see and which we think will be advantageous, we'll talk about a little bit more in a second. There's a high degree of directionality when you hit a pickleball. Most of the sound is kind of going in the direction of the ball, that is to say, kind of perpendicular to the racket. And if you go off axis, you notice a big reduction in sound levels. So I would just kind of add that to what Barry said, that we can probably optimize courts depending on where the sensitive receptors are and kind of how the court is laid out. And my question for Susan, and I think is a question that a lot of people in the chat had, can you tell us about how far away the worst case kind of pickleball being hit to the sensitive person was? And not to put you too on the spot, can you tell us about the sound level that they were experiencing when the pickleball was hit?
Well, they were probably about 190 feet. The edge of the pickleball court where the ball would be hit was about 190 feet from the rear of their home. And to actually also respond to your point, it was in the direction of their home. So the ball was being hit into the direction of their home. And when we did a noise study, or when we talked to the neighbors, the people who lived equidistant, but to the sides of the court, heard almost nothing.
That's totally consistent with the
Yes.
measurements that we've done recently, where we see sometimes up to a 20 decibel kind of difference on
Yes.
axis versus off axis. That's more effective than any sound barrier we would ever consider. So
Yeah,
just
I
the
think
orientation it really seems to be significant.
additionally, between those orientations, going from the 190 feet upslope to the resident who was most disturbed in the line of play, that was probably a 30-foot or 25-foot elevation change. The homes that were to the 90-degree angle change, so they were not in the line of play, were probably only at a 5-foot elevation change. And so they were mostly at level with the court. And they almost said they almost heard nothing ever of it, of this noise. So,
And my final
after,
question, and this one's from really on behalf of Kristen, is would you consider writing up your findings in the Noise Control Engineering Journal, for instance? We would love to have documentation of exactly what you just shared. This is a terrific case study.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And I was interrupting you, Susan. I'm
No,
sorry.
I was going to, I can't answer your last question off the top of my head because I can't recall what the highest reading was on it, on the level.
Okay.
Maybe you were saying it's 1,000. I have that in my document, but I don't have it in front of me.
And I have a slide that illustrates a little bit of what Barry was talking about in terms of the levels, and then what we estimate the level as a function of distance was. That's kind of like introductory material that helps set the stage. Dan, if you think that's useful, I could show that and maybe ask for Barry's comment as well.
Go right ahead.
All right, great, thank you. I think I'm sharing the wrong screen. Give me 1 second. Can you all see that?
Yep.
Great. Right now, mine just says general information, but it's going to decide to wake up in a moment and go on to that general information. There we go. There's the general information we were talking about. You see kind of two figures here that really just illustrate Barry's point and then maybe provide a little bit more context. And I'll come to that context in a minute. What you see in the chart on the left is you see frequency for all my my fellow acoustics nerds on the call. Sorry to introduce this stuff to all the non-nerdy folks. You see pitch, that is to say frequency here, and you see amplitude in terms of decibels here. So what we're looking at is the frequency distribution, all of the kind of all of the pitches, if you will, within that signal. And exactly as Barry said, really focused on 1000 hertz. One of the things I did over here is kind of based on this, you know, pickleball, if you measure it with a standard sound level meter at 1 meter, a lot of meters there. If you measure it at about 3 feet, what you'll find is it's about 98 dBA. And in the graph on the right, what I've done is kind of extrapolated that out. And in the dark line, that's the thing you'd measure on the sound level meter. And you see kind of the x-axis is distance, and the y-axis here is, again, a weighted sound pressure level. I've also kind of shown 3 additional lines here, which seem to be misplaced in my figures, but they are kind of lines that might be the ambient sound level. And one of the things that was mentioned, I think, Dan, it was your first question. I want to go back and take issue with your very first question from 20 minutes ago. Why is pickleball bothersome? Well, I think there's a prior in there that it is bothersome, and I think one of the things I would say, not to be super, annoying about it, but sound is really bothersome when it's out of context with its environment. One of the people that I studied with, like, kind of wrote that in every single report that they sent to the public, which is to say that really what we need to consider is the signal to noise. How much ambient noise is there versus how loud is pickleball noise? And in the figure on the right, you kind of see a very crude comparison of maybe a rural, a suburban, and an urban ambient level. And that difference between the pickleball level and the ambient level is a really good predictor of the way that people will respond. When pickleball sound is well below the ambient, it's very low likelihood that people will be upset by it. But when it's well above the ambient, say 10, 15, maybe even 0 decibels, there's a fairly high probability that people will respond negatively to it. So this is kind of like our framework, if you will, kind of considering signal to noise. And I'll come back to more of that ambient. How do we characterize that ambient for a specific site? But man, that was a lot of talking. I would invite Barry and Susan and others to to comment as well.
There was a question on the metric that was used on that. Is that LAF max or LEQ, or what was it?
Yeah, this is in the figure on the left. This is the spectrum of the LF max, and then the number as the LAF max. On the right, the dotted log curve, or the heavy log curve, is LAF max. Above that is LAI max, that is to say with the impulsive 35 millisecond sound level meter response. And as you would expect, impulsive sound, the exact same event measured on the impulse setting on a sound level meter, is about 5 decibels higher, just as a function of the 2 time constants.
And so just for our recreation people, some of the things that I'm getting so far is that the actual orientation of the course or to homes and properties matters. And also the amount of ambient sound needs to be also thought about when trying to site a court and how far it should be from other people, things you don't want to disturb.
That's exactly kind of the perspective that we take, Dan, and there are multiple ways to look at this, because there's not a whole lot of conclusive science in just yet. But we always kind of take that signal to noise framework, first of all, based on the ambient. And then on top of that, we'll often try to take a soundscape approach, which is to say, not only just in terms of level, but how will the character of the environment change as a function of adding this court? If people are accustomed to hearing a babbling stream and now they're hearing, enthusiastic glee. I love Susan's word. It really characterizes it well. How might they respond to that socially, right? The dimensions of a noise complaint are not just the level at the ear. There's so many other social factors that are baked into making that complaint.
So what else can be done to mitigate noise issue? Is there anything that works? I saw some things in different publications and, like a big heavy mat or, I haven't looked at them too hard because I don't have a court, but are there other things that you can do to help mitigate the noise on a pickleball court?
I kind of prepared a list to that effect because you had given me that great slide up front. Before I go into that, Barry, do you want to offer your thoughts on that?
Yeah, can I share a screen as well here?
Sure.
Let me do that. I'm going to,
We can see it.
uh,
There you go. Perfect.
I went too far. Okay. One of the things that traditional noise engineers look at is a source, a path, and a receiver. So I think if you look at pickleball and an intent to mitigate this noise, questions can be asked from three perspectives. What can we do with the source? And that means, can we do anything with the paddle or the balls that are being used? And I can talk briefly about that just after this. From the standpoint of path, this gets into how the sound travels from the source to the receiver. What can we do to block it, change its direction, or any number of things? And then the third thing is the receiver. What can we do at the receiver's location? Can we provide any shielding or sound mitigation at the receiver? In terms of a noise solution, just like from noise engineering, in some cases, all three of these approaches must be used to achieve a desired result. If you look at, I'm going to skip down here to a little chart that we put together for a paper at one time, trying to look at what can we do for control at the source, and that includes anything from paddles, balls, court time, maybe an enclosure, a tennis bubble, or even a new site selection if that is mandated, which sounds like what was done in Center Township. Control along the path. This gets into the issue of barriers. Barriers are effective, but I think well, everybody has to realize they're not the ultimate solution. You can get maybe 10 to 15 decibel reduction with the barrier, but that by itself may not be enough. And I think a lot of the barrier suppliers have made let's say, large inroads into this noise issue by providing all types of different barriers, either a typical mass-loaded reflective barrier, barriers with sound-absorbing layers on them. Some of them are even very decorative. You can get these in colors. You can get these that are printed with bricks, are printed to look like bricks or ivy. Some of them are even transparent that you can actually see through, like the barriers into freezer compartments that you go into in a Costco. Control at the receiver, again, barriers near the receiver can work. And even sound masking has been proposed in some situation. And this may mean a fountain in somebody's backyard or something to increase the ambient noise. And this sort of gets to what Andy is talking about. Part of the issue here is the signal to noise ratio. And in reality, the reason we're all here is that the popularity of pickleball has somewhat outstripped the availability of courts. So just like we heard in Center County, people are flocking to unused or little used tennis courts, regardless of the fact that they may be in somebody's backyard. And that is an issue. I will address it. And the popularity of pickleball is growing immensely. The last study I saw said that it grew 58% last year. Court availability has only grown at 10%. So you're finding people that are using backyards, driveways, cul-de-sacs, and little used tennis courts. The lack of detail, the second item is the lack of detail in noise ordinances really brings us all to this issue. If the noise ordinances were written properly, with enough detail, then a police officer, as we heard, for Center Township could easily go out to a court and do some sort of a measurement. And then the other item is, because of this popularity, is that recreation departments, homeowners associations really have not done their due diligence. They're responding to popular requests, petitions that may have 75% of the homeowners who have advocated for pickleball, but that really doesn't address the homeowner who's pickleball, who will find a pickleball court 30 feet or 60 feet from their backyard. So those are some of the issues to be addressed.
What is, Barry, can I ask you to follow up? You mentioned 1,000 hertz, I believe. What's a tolerable level of decibels? And does that change according to urban, suburban, rural?
I think Andy brought up a good point, basically saying a tolerable level is based on a signal to noise ratio. So if you have pickleball courts near a highway, I think that would be a great location, because your problem then is not pickleball, your problem is the highway traffic. And pickleball could coexist very easily. It's pretty hard to say what a level is. We have limits that we use in our sound studies that we measure and compare to background noise, and try to make an assessment of the risk of a site for pickleball courts.
Okay. And then I did have an interesting question in the chat here. What's the difference of sound of tennis versus pickleball? I'm assuming it's the sound the ball makes when it hits the racket.
No.
No.
Well, I mean, pickleball has two components of the sound. The ball is a plastic ball, so it contributes some of it, but a large part of it is the paddle itself. And these paddles have gone from plywood, wood paddles, to honeycomb composites with Kevlar, carbon fiber, and fiberglass surfaces. So the difference between that and a tennis ball, which is rubber and is hit by strings, can be anywhere from 10 to 20 decibels higher with pickleball. So, and from a noise standpoint, to my fellow acoustical engineers, 10 dB is twice as loud, 20 dB is 4 times as loud.
Okay. All right. And again, for my two acoustics people, what should a proper sound study? So I was going to cite a pickleball court, and I'm looking at orientation, I'm looking at all those other things that you said. What should a proper sound study include before I invest money in pickleball?
Do you mind if I take that one?
No, go right ahead.
Yeah, because I totally agree with everything that Barry said, and it really kind of leads nicely to some of the questions that are in the chat. One of the questions is like, what ought the level of regulation be? And that seems like such a simple question that is fiendishly difficult to answer. And so what I'm going to try to do is walk you through some of that. Big picture, kind of that sound study would have stakeholder engagement up front, really determining what the design goals of any kind of noise control engineering design would be, saying, what do we want to hear? Is it okay to hear pickleball in these different locations? Do people really not want to hear pickleball? Really kind of establishing the community expectations and standards in kind of an open dialogue. The next thing that you would do is you would take a really detailed survey of the applicable regulations. To what extent, say I was working for the developer as an acoustical consultant, one of my primary obligations is to help them understand what kind of risk they may be under, risk of lawsuit, risk of nuisance. So conducting a survey of the regulations. And then we do a deep study of kind of what exists today. We would characterize both the existing levels and the existing soundscape, the experience of being in that acoustic environment. From that, we build a computer model. I think Barry's team does a very similar thing. We build a computer model, and that computer model would include things like the effects of topography. It would include things like, if we put a barrier at a specific location, how much reduction would that result in? And then we'd compare kind of what exists today, the existing conditions, to that predicted condition. And you could do that on paper. You could say, it's 30 today and it's going to be 42 tomorrow. And I find that to be generally meaningless to most people that I speak to. People don't have a sensation of 42 dB in the same way that they have a sensation of green. You know what I mean? Like there's not a good way of understanding these numbers for acoustical consultants and certainly not for the public. So the thing that we think is really, really important here is kind of to develop a simulation and really let people hear what that would sound like in some way in advance. We take this perspective of kind of using computer modeling and really kind of building a set of simulations where we can say, here's what it would sound like at specific instances with the kind of existing ambient, and then also kind of say, what would it sound like with different interventions, barriers, berms, quiet paddles, court orientation. What we found, at least at Acentech, is that we don't want to be in the business of telling people what they ought to find acceptable. You know what I mean? We don't really know, and I think that changes as a function of community and just so many different demographic factors. We want to be in the business of informing stakeholders what they ought to expect and helping them kind of shape that in advance. I know, Barry, I think your team does some simulation stuff as well, right? To kind of to that similar end.
Yeah, I can, let me get to something real quickly here. Can I share a screen as well?
By all means, Barry.
I will share a screen here. I think this alludes to what Andy was talking about in terms of a sound study. This is a model that we created of a pickleball court in a California location, and it was in a downtown area, and they had complaints about pickleball, and they asked us how high would the walls need to be. So we raise the walls from 10 feet to 20 feet. And I believe this is a view with a 20-foot barrier. It shows some sound paths from a location here within the southeast corner of this court. You can see some radiating sound rays, which is those little dotted lines. It basically shows the travel of sound. There's some houses and apartment residences that were right across the street. Our goal was to get into a green range. And our recommendation to them in this situation, which I think was about 60, 70 feet away, was the pickleball courts are too close. These were previously tennis courts that they converted. And we recommended that they move them to a different location. It took a while, but I believe that is what is happening now. And for the recreation department, people that are on this, part of the conversion strategy in a lot of this activity is such that with a tennis court, which is about 60 by 120, the most people I can get on that is 4 people playing a game of doubles. In that space, I can put up to 4 pickleball courts. So I can get 16 participants on the same real estate that previously for tennis I had 4. So it's a great use of space, provided it's not a noise annoyance for the community. So I can see where the recreation department people are seeing a great use of their facilities, but it does require some due diligence and getting some engineering involvement to make sure that you're not following the steps that Susan Wheeler talked about converting, reconverting, and then trying to do some other things. And there are some new equipment that's coming out. There's some quieter paddles. I will say quieter. They are not silent. There are some balls, or there's at least one ball that was introduced a couple weeks ago called the Librarian. It is a foam ball. It's markedly different. The jury is still out in terms of whether people will accept the dynamics and the bounce of the ball. It is quieter, but part of it is what the people will accept in their play of pickleball.
Yeah.
I want to just jump on that if I could, because I think Barry hits this great point. I guess I didn't mean to make that pun, but I'm going to take it, which is that there's really kind of two things going. I think we can give you silent pickleball if we require that everyone hit the ball with a pillow, right? So there's this idea of the softness of that racket. We can have very, very quiet interactions, but it comes at the expense of the feel of play, you know, how much power you actually deliver to the ball and the experience of playing. So there's this really kind of interesting optimization function that we're studying right now. How can you minimize the amount of sound that comes off while still kind of preserving the power and the feel of that racket?
And then to your point, Barry, when you said you increased this number of people using the same area from 4 to 16, you know, that's the hooting and hollering Susan had to went through when they converted. And that was sort of, I think that's an unexpected benefit to conversion of tennis courts to pickleball courts also.
Yeah, I think it is, but I think also there's a slightly different group of people who play the sports. I think the tennis players tend to be a little quieter, generally speaking, as a personality. I mean, some people play both sports, but when I talk to both tennis players and pickleball players, the intersection is very small between them. And so I think that they're kind of they have a different expectation of play when they play.
And I think in pickleball, and I see this from the standpoint of my own participation as well as being a referee, people play this on a very social level when you first get into it, and it's a great social interaction type thing. At some point, you transition into being very competitive, and then you want the most powerful paddles, the fastest balls, so that you can be tournament ready. So there is that difference in play, and pickleball noise is not always the same smash power hit. There are parts of the game where you're just hitting a very, very soft shot. So the noise actually follows a bell curve, but from a noise standpoint, we're looking at the tail of that bell curve way out in the right hand end, where either 97, 2 sigma or 3 sigma of the noise is below that. So that's part of the issue of addressing the noise.
Yeah, I think I agree, Barry, that's true. And I think I agree with your description of how people progress through the game as they start off in a more social atmosphere and then they turn to more competitive. The other issue with that we see in public recreational play with tennis and many other things is that if you're a beginner tennis player or a beginner paddleball player, you're buying the cheapest thing that you can buy off the rack, which are usually the noisiest.
That's
additionally.
true.
So you only are able to graduate into the group of people who can afford the quietest things on the market if you're financially able to do so. So what we find is that even, we find kids going out to playing things like that, and they're buying their rackets at the grocery store. I saw them in Weiss Market the other day, and they're really just plywood. So I think that there's a real range of the product depending on where you are in that play and your financial ability and age and other things like that.
And I have a request from Brian Barrett who wants to share something. He's one of our rec people here at Penn in Pennsylvania. Brian, go ahead.
Thank you. One of the challenges we found, we installed our first courts where we converted 2 tennis courts to 8 pickleball courts back in like 2014. And it wasn't until about 2021 we were starting to get some complaints from the neighbors. So by that point, we had already converted 2 other courts to 4 pickleball courts. And since then, another 2 courts to 6 pickleball courts. We have a total of 18 outdoor courts. But the challenge is the sheer volume of play. If you have local kids that play basketball next to your house, they might be there 2 or 3 nights a week or maybe on the weekends. If you have a football game or a baseball game going, it's limited in play. Because the average age is slightly older in pickleball, we are getting 7 days a week, 10 hours a day, 5 hours in the morning and 5 hours in the evening for as many as 6 months a year. So I think that is, besides we did a noise study and we were violating our own noise ordinance. We did put up sound curtains at a very significant expense. We paid to wrap one half of the 8 courts about $17,000 in sound curtains. It definitely lowered the decibel level, but didn't make the neighbors feel like that we were addressing their concerns. The other thing I would say, which was brought up about the equipment, is in a public setting, it's hard to mandate certain equipment. And I go back to what the gentleman said about competition. It'd be like asking somebody to play with a basketball that doesn't bounce when you're used to a certain ball that does bounce. You're asking them to play a less game. And I think that would be challenging to do that with participants. We are struggling, and one of the other things we've done, we did a sound survey at a significant cost and found out we were violating our sound ordinance. But the other thing is some municipalities, and we're considering doing this in our municipality, not for this, but for other reasons, is saying that the ordinances related to these types of things don't apply to the township. And there's a thought that maybe we would put that in. Having said that, we've gone to some considerable work and effort to try to address neighbors' concerns. And now we're looking at limiting play on certain days, because that's the sort of the last refuge for the homeowners. The weird thing about this is the homeowners that we get the most complaints with are the homeowners that are furthest away from our courts. They're not real far. They're about 150 feet, but we have other courts that are within 30 and 40 feet of property lines. And we don't get nearly the number of complaints there. And it really is a function of, I think, people being home all day and just the constancy of it and the volume. At the one court, the volume is much higher and we were getting a lot of non-residents. So I just wanted to share those things because we've been sort of dealing with this now for like 3 years and with limited effectiveness. So.
Anybody want to comment on Brian's unique, well, not unique situation, but situation?
Let me add something here. The question, I think, from a recreation director standpoint is number of courts, because obviously that accommodates greater number of players. One of the accepted standards about pickleball is you'll hear about 15 impulses of a paddle striking a ball in any 1 minute period of time, based on the rallies that are going on and so forth. So if you extrapolate that to an hour, that means in that hour, I'm hearing 900 impulses. Now, if you add 4 courts, 8 courts, you're having that many impulses in a certain period of time. From a noise mitigation, a noise reduction standpoint, our goal when we are asked to do site analysis is that we say, I don't care whether there's 1 pickleball court or 20, the noise from any one of those courts should be a low enough level so that it is not bothersome. Because I know there are questions of, well, what happens if there's only 4 courts as opposed to all 16 courts in use? Sure, you're going to hear fewer impulses in any certain period of time, but the goal from a noise mitigation standpoint and engineering standpoint is, I want to look at that 97th percentile or 99th percentile on the bell curve, and I want that to be low enough, as Andy was saying, with respect to an ambient noise, so that it really doesn't matter. It's low enough so that the homeowner will not be bothered whether there's one court in play or there are 8 courts in play.
And that ambient noise level can just shift so much as a function of time of day and then day of the week. If you don't mind, I wanted to just share kind of a slide that characterizes that a little bit.
Please do, yeah.
Yeah, so if you can see that again, what you see here is really just one particular day. This is a Sunday, usually the quietest day. When we do these studies, we're going to gather data, over an extended period of time. And what you'll start to see are some trends. Saturday is pretty busy during the day. Sunday is really, really quiet. Monday and Tuesday kind of increasing in busyness as you get into Saturday. But when does everyone want to go out and play? On a bluebird day on Sunday, right? And so Sunday is already kind of a challenging time. And then when you zoom in on Sunday, I could see wanting to get to the court really early at like 8 or 9 in the morning when the ambient might be, this is the L90 that I'm pointing out for my acoustical consultant friends. The ambient might be, 5 to 10 decibels lower. And it's been our experience, and I think the experience of many on the call, that this ambient is really like has a protective effect, right? That we experience the sound of pickleball in the context of this ambient. So we go out and survey this, and you see our sound level meter here. We're also kind of measuring this using spatial audio. So we're capturing a full-on ambisonic kind of rendering of the ambient. And then we're folding that down to binaural so people can hear that on headphones. And what we're really doing is saying, we want to let you hear, just as Barry showed, kind of the estimated pickleball levels, but hear them in the context of the ambient and some different design kind of interventions. So what I'm stepping through here briefly is kind of our process of bringing that together, really culminating in the simulation. What we're trying to do is allow stakeholders to make a determination about what might exist in the future and see if they like it, and kind of provide some context for that evaluation. There's a really interesting thing about listening indoors that I've learned, which is that when you go indoors, clearly a pickleball sound will be quieter. The window will attenuate the sound going in. But the ambient sound level will also be much, much, much lower indoors. And that reduction of ambient is usually at a steeper rate than the reduction of sound through the window, for example. What that means, which is really odd, is that certain phenomenon are more audible, more perceptible, more detectable inside, where their sound level is slightly lower because the ambient is less. And so one of the things that we like to do is kind of evaluate what would it be like, for example, with different barriers, and to hear those things, to listen inside of different spaces at a given facility, and really allow like an owner, a developer, a community member, a regulator to say, yeah, that seems okay to me. Because the question, what is an appropriate level? I don't know that there's a closed form solution to that question. I think that the answer really depends a lot, and a huge way of maybe kind of stacking the deck in your favor for a favorable outcome is to really build that community kind of stakeholder engagement in advance. We found that when people feel part of the process, they haven't been excluded from the process. They have a much greater likelihood of responding favorably in the future.
So I'm hearing from all of you that, when we talk about what is, a satisfactory pickleball court look like, the answer is it depends. But it depends on the orientation. It depends on distance. There's like is there one safe distance between a pickleball court and a house?
Yeah, like 36 miles. Right? You can only have like a silly answer, like 36 miles is good. But everything other than that, it really depends, and the details really matter a lot, and the rigor with which those details are studied. In that rigor lies the public's health to a certain extent.
And does topography have an effect?
It does. One of the things you saw in Barry's model was how they're actually analyzing topography. Barry, please don't let me speak for your awesome slide.
No, I obviously topography, gentle rolling hills and so forth, probably, let's say gentle changes in elevation will not have a significant effect, but there are situations where hills, mounds and so forth, and even the buildings that are associated next to these can have major effects. And that's why I think anybody who's looking at siting a pickleball court should probably have some sort of engineering expertise. And I'll go out on a limb here and try to address this distance, because everybody would like, we can measure distance real easily. We can't always measure noise with the same metrics, but I think anything less than 1,000 feet from a pickleball court requires some engineering involvement to provide some recommendations or assessment.
Thank you. So I'm noticing the time. We do have a couple minutes left, and I did see a question on the chat that caught my eye. Somebody would like to know, when seeking engineering advice, what would you agree to what kind of recommendations would you make for a sound study?
Nalini offers a really great kind of question, and really kind of puts it to Barry and Susan and I think. And just to really respond to Nalini's question, yeah, I agree with all the things that you have on that list there. There was 5 things. I would probably clearly agree with Dana that in-sport certification or a PE, obviously, or like a demonstrable amount of experience where the public's health is concerned. I think those are all really important. I would say that potentially the thing I would add would be the ability to not just predict the level, but to listen to the resulting effects of the proposed development.
Barry, would you like to add?
I would agree. I don't have anything further.
Okay. And Susan, go ahead.
I would agree. I think that every area or every potential location for pickleball is site specific. And so you cannot come up with any generalization. I think maybe an additional note to add is when we went through all of these studies and processes and the board decided to change locations, they also adopted a policy that we would not develop any pickleball courts in public parks within 350 feet of a structure. Now, that was not scientifically based, but having said that, we have only parks left where you cannot develop anything within that distance. So de facto, we will not be building any more pickleball courts in Patton Township. So that 350 feet was not scientific, but it was a recommendation from our RAC because they looked at our parks and said, what's the closest house? And looking at the characteristic of this neighborhood, how bad can it be, essentially? And so we now will not be doing any more pickleball court construction because of those kinds of limitations. And we're a densely populated area mostly. And where we've placed our new courts are in a geographically distant area where there will not be residences growing up around. So
Okay.
every site is very specific to its own needs.
And I would add one thing to what Susan is saying before everybody jumps on a bandwagon and say, oh, no pickleball court should ever be located within 350 feet. We have seen situations where pickleball courts are under 200 feet from a residence and they coexist. However, the solution to that was a 12-foot high barrier. The barrier had a sound absorbing liner on the inside, as well as being a mass loaded vinyl. A specific subset of quieter pickleball paddles was mandated, and a specific ball was mandated to be used, one of the softer non-tournament type balls. How do they control this? It is a private facility, and if you want to pay to play in this facility, these are what you have to have. And the other players actually are policemen on this, and they won't let somebody come into this court with an unapproved paddle because that ruins the situation for everybody else who has followed the rules.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Barry, because the other situation here is that we have the local YMCA, which is in a very densely populated part of town, and they've developed a YMCA, you pay to play, but they put in a higher fence. They're within 40 feet of the residences around, which are multiple like apartment buildings and things like that. But everybody has to follow the same rules. So I would agree that in this case, which is a private facility, you can have more regulation on how it's played with and how you build it and other things. In a public facility, you're tending to respond to the needs of your residents who want a new recreational opportunity. And sometimes these things are handled differently, although they should not be, but they tend to be handled differently just because of the nature of the two animals.
Yeah, it's good when you can control it, because the Y requires you to show your Y pass before they let you on the court. But I know, and like Brian and many other people's things, it's just hard to regulate what paddles you're going to use and ask, yeah, like he said, hit a baseball with a wiffle ball bat sort of thing. And so I can respect the trouble that all this pickleball can provide. My last question to you guys is, what are your final thoughts on how this all may play out going forward? Is pickleball just going to be a fad, or is it here to stay? What's going to happen?
I think
I'll take that. Go ahead, Barry.
I think it's here to stay based on the growth that I've seen. And I saw somebody asked about the numbers. These are some sports organizations' numbers on people who have played pickleball at least once a year. Now, there are people who play 4 and 5 times a week or more. I think it's here to stay because it meets many needs, just in terms of it's a very social game. You meet new people. The average age of participation is gone from the 50s down to somewhere in the 30s. If you look at the pro level, and there is a pro level in pickleball, it's dominated by people in their teens or their early 20s. And a lot of these have come from NCAA tennis backgrounds as well. So it hits many fronts, but it's not to say that this can grow unchecked, just in terms of being aware of some of the issues of noise. Susan?
I'd agree with you, Barry. And actually, I would say that when we also did our first studies, not only did we want to satisfy the older demographic that was interested in pickleball, but the younger demographic of parents of young tennis players who wanted to start their kids off with pickleball because it's a smaller court to understand the relationship of a paddle or a bat and a ball in relationship to their body in a racket sport. But I think it's here to stay. I say that to people all the time in State College. State College is a community with 5 different municipalities, and we all develop our own recreational spaces. And people ask me about pickleball and they say, you must hate it. And I say, I do not hate it. I would encourage everybody else in the community to build more public pickleball if it's placed in the right place. Because I think it's a growing sport and we don't have enough public facilities, and people should embrace it and be educated and look at studies, because clearly there are certain ways that you can look at specific sites that can add to the community. And I think that it's something that we should all be looking forward to working on and being a little bit more educated about it.
And I want to just kind of follow on exactly what Susan said. I think the problem here is that people are outdoors, getting more fresh air, getting more exercise and social engagement. Like, that's a great problem to have, right? So like, I hope it stays popular. I hope that we do more of this. And I think Susan said it better than I will, that we need to be responsible about this. Like those of you who have read the article in the Times about pickleball noise, it's absolutely heartbreaking. Like the potential for harm is real. You've heard some of those harms today. What ought to be done? Well, really rigorous science needs to be done here to understand perception and kind of noise exposure. This is a shameless plug for the Institute of Noise Control Engineering. This is one of the preeminent places that this is being studied. We have a conference coming up. Barry's team, my team, many other great researchers will contribute to that conference on, to share their findings publicly in a peer-reviewed way. We're not at the point of having consensus on regulation yet. I really hope in the next year or two we get there, that we have a greater body of scientific knowledge to support good enforceable regulation on this, to A, encourage its development, and B, in a responsible way that minimizes the harm. So shameless plug for INS, that's one of the places that a lot of this research is happening. And just my final thought is that I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. And I love Parks people. So to all the Parks people here, thank you so much for these beautiful spaces that you make for us. Thanks.
Okay, Barry and Andy, I would encourage you to go ahead and put your contact information in the chat for people who may want to reach out and get in touch with you. You both work for some wonderful organizations, and I want to thank INCE, Institute of Noise Control Engineers, for helping me put together this webinar. I hope you all got something out of it. And Susan, thank you also for stepping up and offering your site as a case study for all of us. We really appreciate you doing that. You can do an, I just put in the chat box, I think I did. Here we go. There in the chat box is a link to the SurveyMonkey site where you can fill out an evaluation, or you can copy the QR code on your cell phone and get there also. For those of you who need CEUs and have registered for the CEU, the code phrase is "what a racket." And that is all for today. On behalf of PRPS, I want to thank everybody for attending and sticking with us today, and I hope you all got something out of it. Thank you, everyone. And I'll leave this up for a little bit so that you people can get that SurveyMonkey code.
Dan, thank you so much. And Barry and Susan, it's a pleasure to get to present with you. Thanks for the opportunity. Take care.
Yes,
Guys
thank
are
you.
For
great.
letting us share our information.
Thank you, Dan. And thank you, Barry and Andy. Nice to meet you both.
Lots of thank yous. I hope I'll share those evaluations with you soon.